Before I begin, I would like to say how sorry I am not to be with you in person, and how grateful I am to Alberto Pancorbo and Susanna Maraval for their support and help in arranging for me to deliver my lecture in this form. I also wish to thank the translator and to apologise for my inability to speak Spanish. So, to my subject, who was, of course, French. Jean Fouquet, native of Tours in western France, was one of the great painters of the 15th century. Although we don't know very much about his life, we do know what he looked like. His name appears so prominently beside this head that it is surely a self-portrait, executed with a brush in enamel rather than in oil paint. He was also a manuscript illuminator. In the Netherlands, painting and illumination tended to be separate professions. In France, it was usual for painters on panels, cloths and walls also to be illuminators. Fouquet is known to have produced panel and cloth paintings, designed and polychrome sculpture, and designed theatrical tableaux. Designs for stained glass and tapestry can also be attributed to him. In documents surviving from his lifetime, there is only one reference to him as an illuminator when he was called up to guard his hometown of Tours, probably in 1464. Otherwise, he was described as painter from the first references to him in 1461, when, already prominent, he was apparently involved with the funeral effigy of King Charles VII and was also paid for preparations to welcome the new king, Louis XI. Louis was coming to Tours, a great centre of royal patronage for both kings. Fouquet probably died in 1481. On 8th November of that year, his widow and two sons, also painters, took possession of his property in Tours. The highly unusual form of the self-portrait in enamel has allowed its original context and purpose to be deduced. It acted as the artist's signature on a sadly dismembered diptych painted for the Treasurer of France, Etienne Chevalier, where he is presented by his named patron, St. Stephen, to the Virgin and Child. The diptych is datable to the 1450s, from what is known of both artist and sitter. The image shows the two panels when they were briefly reunited in Berlin in 2017. The modern frames were designed to echo the description of the lost originals, which were covered in blue velvet, patterned with enamelled medallions, and Chevalier's device of two E's, all in gold. Among the gold enamelled medallions was surely the self-portrait, not shown to scale because it would be too small to be legible. It is important to bear in mind those broad patterned frames, since they would have both separated and united the two panels with their assertively different settings. Behind the figures, we find elements familiar from mid-15th century Italian art, but very novel in France at that date. Chevalier's dramatically receding classicising architecture and the Italianate cherubs surrounding the Virgin demonstrate a depth of knowledge of Italian Renaissance art, particularly of that associated with Florence, which was not apparently shared by other artists active in France at that date. Fouquet acquired this knowledge in Italy. Two independent contemporaries record that he painted a portrait of Pope Eugenius IV in Rome. A portrait which can therefore be dated between 1443, when Eugenius arrived in Rome, and 1447, when he died. The original on cloth is lost. It showed the Pope with two associates and was surely a precedent for Raphael's portrait of Leo X. The only copies of Fouquet's Eugenius IV reproduce the Pope alone to bust length, but the engraving shows that his pose with arms resting on a table was similar to Leo X's. Fouquet's portrait would have been a great novelty when Italian portraits favoured the artificial and remote profile. The three-quarters pose allows for far greater engagement with the viewer, even if the sitter's gaze is not directed towards him but past him, as here. Fouquet's ability to make a painted image seem real, to produce natural works, by inference indistinguishable from nature, was specified by one of the contemporary witnesses to the portrait of Eugenius. The inclusion of two associates to make a group portrait of interacting people would have been equally novel in the context of the Italian profile convention. That the portrait should still impact on Raphael over 60 years later gives some indication of its exceptional nature in the Roman context, and also of its enduring success. Raphael's Leo X demonstrates Fouquet's influence on an artist of the High Renaissance. It was, of course, the Italian early Renaissance that influenced Fouquet himself, particularly the work of Masolino. You see here his frescoes of St. Catherine in San Clemente in Rome, and Fra Angelico, both key figures in the history of Florentine art. It is not known whether Fouquet visited Florence. He possibly did, but not necessarily so. The kind of art admired and practiced in Florence was also visible in Rome, where the establishment of an undivided papacy stimulated major projects of restoration and new building. The surge in artistic patronage brought many artists to Rome, either specifically recruited or attracted there by the prospect of lucrative commissions. Masolino's frescoes in San Clemente had been completed by early 1431, and it seems clear that Fouquet absorbed their content and approach. The use of geometric perspective to create dramatic illusions of deep spaces, the setting of figures against walls emphatically receding on diagonals, the forms of all'antica, antique architecture, partly articulated by panels of coloured marble, can all be seen in Fouquet's Chevalier panel. Masolino's collaborator Masaccio possibly contributed to the San Clemente frescoes. His hand is certainly recognisable in the altarpiece for the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which Masolino had to complete alone. Fouquet knew Masaccio and Masolino through their work. Fra Angelico he surely knew personally, since Fra Angelico arrived in Rome in the second half of 1445, also to work for Eugenius IV. It is not known when Fouquet left Rome, possibly before Angelico completed the Vatican Chapel of St. Lawrence and St. Stephen, seen here. But Fouquet could have been shown the designs. Angelico's earlier frescoes for the Pope are all lost, but were presumably available to Fouquet. He could have found in Angelico, even more than in Masolino, the inspiration for his human figures, simplified into smooth contours and firmly modelled to create three-dimensional forms approaching the regularity of spheres, cones and cylinders. In the upper register here, for instance, the cones of the seated figures on the left and the cylinder of the back view St. Lawrence on the right. From both he could have learnt how to redirect the antique decorative vocabulary to Christian ends. Fra Angelico, influenced profoundly by Donatello, may have encouraged him to seek out works by Donatello. It should also be remembered that Angelico and other artists then in Rome might have been willing to share with Fouquet their own stock of patterns and drawings, perhaps accumulated from a wide variety of sources. Drawings may have introduced Fouquet to a greater range of art than that indicated by those works that have happened to survive. There are two generally accepted surviving works from Donatello's time in Rome in the early 1430s. This is the tomb slab of Giovanni Crivelli, very worn because it was originally set into the floor of Santa Maria in Araceli. A conventional image of the deceased is surrounded by the newly fashionable adjuncts of antique sculpture pioneered by Brunelleschi and Donatello himself, a shell niche and putti holding a shield, surely originally painted with Crivelli's coat of arms. Both features will reappear in Fouquet's work. Much richer as a source was the ciborium or tabernacle, then probably in one of the papal chapels. Please ignore the later edition of the Madonna painting, which obscures the central compartment. Originally, the classically inspired angels prayed towards the host, which was probably both protected and revealed by a grille. Here Fouquet would have seen antique architecture as three-dimensional framing that does not just frame but is integral to the work and its purpose. The play between different levels of illusion is partly conveyed by how fully the three-dimensionality of sculpture is employed. The angels, praying towards the actual body of Christ, physically present in the form of the consecrated bread, are almost fully in the round. They are echoed in the angels above, who raise a curtain to reveal what is clearly intended as an image, of Christ's body being placed in the tomb, just as the bread that is his body will physically be placed into the actual recess of the ciborium. The different level of representation of the upper entombment scene is emphasised by its comparatively low relief, removing it further from the greater three-dimensionality of the angels and then the fully three-dimensional nature of reality. We will see Fouquet developing similar ideas after his return to France. A Florentine sculptor Fouquet actually met in Rome was Antonio Filarete, also engaged by Eugenius IV to produce a pair of bronze doors for St. Peter's. Presumably inspired by Ghiberti's self-portrait and signature on the north doors of the Florentine baptistry, Filarete signed his doors both with a written name and self-portraits. One of those in the framing is shown in the detail. Later better known as an architect, Filarete is one of the two witnesses to Fouquet's authorship of the portrait of Eugenius IV, writing that it was executed while Filarete was in Rome. It seems very likely that Filarete's self-portrait signatures encouraged Fouquet to place his self-portrait on the frame of Etienne Chevalier's diptych. His presence there must have required Chevalier's consent, or at least acquiescence. Perhaps Fouquet's status was already such that Chevalier wanted his diptych to be known as Fouquet's work. In any event, Fouquet was not so seduced by the attraction of the antique that he adopted the Italian profile convention, which had received renewed validation from the conscious imitation of Roman coins and cameos, as in Filarete's self-portrait. It was Filarete who praised Fouquet for his naturalism, his ability to create plausible illusions of reality, the hallmark of a great painter, as learnt from Pliny and other writers of antiquity, those who can produce painted grapes that birds try to eat, or a portrait recognised by the sitter's dog, and so on. In the mid-15th century, these qualities were most evident not among the Italian artists reinterpreting the art of antiquity, but among Netherlanders like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. Here is a signature self-portrait by Rogier van der Weyden, as preserved in the tapestry version of his Lost Justice scenes in the town hall in Brussels. The names and art of Van Eyck and van der Weyden were well known in Italy, whereas the art of Italy did not become widely sought after and imitated north of the Alps until the end of the 15th century. It is most unlikely that Fouquet in France could have learnt enough of the new Florentine styles to inform his decision to go to Italy. If his journey was motivated by art, it was probably for the opposite reason, that his Netherlandish-based skills would have found a ready market there. Pilgrimages, church affairs, and more secular diplomacy all ensured constant travel between France and Rome, particularly as the seat of the papacy. Once there, Fouquet acquired the new classicising vocabulary of Donatello and Fra Angelico, a new experience of single vanishing point perspective, but his art remained rooted in the Franco-Netherlandish tradition. Fouquet may have travelled in the Netherlands, but there is no need to posit such a journey. So many Netherlandish artists worked in France through the centuries, so much Netherlandish art was available there, that Fouquet did not need to travel north to experience Netherlandish art. In the diptych, Fouquet's ability as a portraitist is evident in the convincingly individualised portrait of Etienne Chevalier. It is less apparent that the startlingly fashionable and glamorous Virgin is also in a sense a portrait. She clearly owes little to the female types of Van Eyck and van der Weyden, or to contemporary Florentine Madonnas, although van der Weyden may have helped inspire her geometry, the play of triangles and circles. A tradition dating back to at least 1608 records that the Virgin has the features of Agnès Sorel, mistress of Charles VII and a famed beauty. Later copies of what seems to have been a straightforward portrait by Fouquet of La Belle Agnès, the beautiful Agnes, do resemble the Virgin and so support the accuracy of the traditional identification. This contemporary model may help to explain why the Virgin is so disconcertingly up to date. It is easy to overlook that she still has the flowing hair of her virginity and sovereignty, which has been relegated behind her neck so as not to upset the effect of her modish, scraped-back hairstyle. Fouquet's bold originality should not be minimised by the intriguing quest for his sources, whether Italian or Netherlandish. His work is distinct from both. Even his three-quarter view portraits tend to be turned more towards the profile than is usual in Netherlandish practice, and his seemingly meticulous depictions of textures and light effects, well suited to the oil medium, are economically achieved by a comparatively broad technique. If we look at a detail such as the fringes on the Virgin's throne, they are cleverly created with minimal effort, small lighter strokes applied over a base colour. The sharp highlights on the angel suggest a surface very different from mere human skin and help to establish his otherworldliness. The shiny knop of the throne is more explicably reflective, though what it reflects, a window, is more puzzling, surely intentionally so. There is no window in the painted diptych. This window belongs to the world beyond the paintings, perhaps the world of the viewer, although the diptych was placed in a church, and this is not obviously an ecclesiastical window, or perhaps the world of the painter, as he created the image we still see. This intentional ambiguity surely derives from the great Netherlanders, rather than the famous mirror in Van Eyck's Arnolfini double portrait, which evidently reflects Van Eyck himself, although not in the actual act of painting. Here is van der Weyden's Braque triptych. A glorious landscape extends behind the holy figures, yet Christ's orb reflects a window as well as his own fingers and the orb's jewelled cross. What is this window? There is a subtle interaction between the painting's illusory reality and its actual reality as a created object made in a specific place that goes on to engage the viewers in any number of different places. The interaction is made explicit through the reflected window that brings an obvious artificiality into the convincingly realistic illusion and forces us to question what we are seeing, an illusion that convinces through its detail, yet as a whole represents no actual material reality. Landscape, of course, is not relevant to the Chevalier diptych, but Fouquet's great skills as a landscapist will be seen later. In the construction of space through landscape and architecture, Fouquet was not solely indebted to Italy. I am not suggesting that Fouquet necessarily saw van der Weyden's Sacraments triptych, which I show as an outstanding example of an architectural composition. Netherlandish artists were aware that parallel lines appear to recede to a point, but few of them adopted the rigid limitations of single vanishing point perspective. Instead, they tended to use areas rather than points of convergence, often with more than one, as they combined elements seen from different viewpoints, thus approximating more closely to our experience as we move around the moving world and focus attention on different areas in our field of vision. The flexibility of the Netherlandish approach to linear perspective was shared by Fouquet, who only occasionally employed a single centralised vanishing point, as he explored the possibilities of varying numbers and positions of vanishing points and vanishing areas. And here we need to go beyond his one signed work, the Chevalier diptych, to a very different commission from Etienne Chevalier, his Book of Hours, a prayer book with devotions to be said at fixed hours through the day and night. It now survives only partially, as 47 dismembered miniature pages and one bifolium of text, that is a double leaf. In this illuminated diptych that opened the most important text, the Office of the Virgin, Chevalier is again presented by St. Stephen, but this time kneeling, before, on the opposite leaf, the Virgin and Child, seated within a Gothic archway, but otherwise sharing the same continuous setting of antique architecture. Fouquet was not afraid of mixing styles, having mastered the vocabulary of both. His topographical studies clearly embraced French architecture as well as Roman. Here he exploits the effect of parallel lines appearing to recede to a point, with areas of convergence rather than points of convergence, very much in the Netherlandish manner. It seems to have been Fouquet who translated into paint the observation that straight lines appear to curve at the edges of vision, an effect reproduced in the lines of floor tiles that curve away at both sides of the illuminated diptych. Fouquet thus endowed these very small paintings with the attributes of the entire field of vision. The viewer is presented with an all-encompassing visual experience. Etienne Chevalier, who was never ennobled and therefore had no coat of arms, is repeatedly identified by his name carved into the frieze and by his device of EE on the shields held by the puttee above the frieze and woven into the Virgin's cloth of gold floor covering. An explanation of his double E badge has yet to be found. As is usual in illuminated books, there may be indications of patron, but there is no indication of the artist. But comparison with the diptych on panel leaves no doubt that they are both the work of the same hand, although it is important to remember that the comparison is between two objects of very different size and very different technique. Here they are roughly to scale. On the left, a panel from a diptych that will have to be viewed from some distance for the whole to be visible at once. On the right, a page from a book, to be placed on a desk or held in the hands, of a size to be seen in its entirety from close to. Despite the vast difference in scale between the diptychs on parchment and panel, Chevalier's head is based on the same drawing, although in the illumination he appears turned slightly further into profile by making his nose just break the contour of his far cheek. The very similar shading is very differently achieved. Instead of the blended strokes of oil painting, the largely gum-based body colour of illumination is suited to fine, separate strokes, sometimes reduced to stippled dots, which remain distinct as they combine optically to create shadows and lights, as well as intimating textures. If the detail is broadened, we can see how fine strokes of powdered gold used as a pigment create highlights that literally sparkle with reflected light. The gold also stands for itself, for the cloth of gold bands on vestments and in the gilded architecture. Fouquet's minute delicacy of touch in his illuminations contrasts with the broader economy of his larger scale work in oil. The gum medium of illumination is suited to the flexible parchment page that will be repeatedly turned, and it's also suited to the protective environment of a book. Kept closed, a book has limited exposure to light, allowing for the use of a wider range of pigments, including light fugitive dyestuffs from plants. But the 47 surviving miniatures of the Chevalier Hours are no longer in a book. It was dismembered probably in the early 18th century, and the miniatures turned into independent pictures. It is as frame pictures that 40 of them are displayed today in the Château of Chantilly, in accordance with the bequest of the Duc d'Aumale, who purchased them in 1891. On the screen in subsequent slides, I have given locations only for those miniatures from the Chevalier Hours that are not in Chantilly. Significantly, the Duke placed his miniatures in the heart of his museum, the Sanctuary, for which he used the Italian Santuario, where they joined his most treasured paintings, his Raphael Madonna, obtained in 1869, and Raphael's Three Graces, purchased in 1885. The following year, 1892, they were joined by Filippino Lippi. For the Duc d'Aumale, Raphael and the High Renaissance represented the peak of artistic achievement, and Fouquet, with his equally serene geometry, belonged there too, satisfying the nationalism prevalent in art history of the time by showing that a French painter could hold his own with Raphael. Fouquet's distinctive style was sufficiently Italian to qualify as great art by the standards of the day, yet was recognised as not wholly Italian and so satisfyingly French. Fouquet also shared with Raphael a genius for narrative painting. If we move into the miniature at bottom left, below the two miniatures of the diptych, we find a narrative scene, the marriage of the Virgin, where she is marrying Joseph, designated as her husband by his rod that bursts into flower. Around them are the unsuccessful suitors whose rods have remained barren. Fouquet carefully gives the marriage of the Virgin the correct setting of the Temple of Solomon, which he created from his collection of Roman drawings, one that we posit he must have accumulated them. The twisted columns in St. Peter's, believed to have come from the temple, are added to a version of the triumphal arch of Septimus Severus. Although settings are important for narrative, it is the people, their postures and expressions, that must carry the story. Mary and Joseph, both slightly hesitant, obey the will of God with a stable serenity that contrasts with the more agitated figures of the curious priests who crowd forward behind the high priest. The suitors are individually characterised by presenting a range of emotions, the yearning, angry disappointment of the man to the front, and the slightly mocking puzzlement of his fellow, pointing at the old man who has so surprisingly won the prize. Fouquet's figures can be overlooked in the appreciation of his spatial illusions, but they repay attention. Despite their current state, the Chevalier miniatures were created for a book, to accompany words without necessarily being straightforward illustrations of text. They mark the openings of different devotions. On the left, St. John the Evangelist on Patmos signals the opening verses of his Gospel, and not an extract from Revelations, as might be expected. The marriage of the Virgin opens the office of the Virgin to be said in Advent. All but one of the miniature pages carried text. With some miniatures, as on the right, the text has survived because it has been relegated to the bottom of the page. Instead of black ink on whitish parchment, ornamented gold letters appear against a coloured ground. The gold and colours of the line of text and its decorative shapes ally it to the painting above. Importantly for the overall design, the blue and green of Mary and Joseph are repeated in the initial bottom left. The broad band of colour anchors the composition and defines the start of the imagined space in the miniature. On the right, St. John is an example of text that was more conventionally written and placed. I say it was written and placed because around 1700 the text was erased and overpainted with a flower piece, leaving the decorated initial I of In Principio as something sufficiently pictorial not to be an interruption. You can get an idea of how the Chevalier Ars originally looked from a later book of Ars, where Fouquet developed some of the patterns from the Chevalier Ars. The text has been written as it would be in any book, in ink on the prepared parchment. Fouquet has thus incorporated the text into the spatial illusion of the miniature by making it appear as if on a board, held up by the putti who occupy the foreground. This was far from a usual arrangement when the Chevalier Ars was illuminated in the 1450s. A more standard layout is seen on the left, in an earlier book of Ars of circa 1420, illuminated in Paris by the anonymous Boucicaut master. It came to be owned by Etienne Chevalier, who had his EE badge added, perhaps by Fouquet himself, below the miniature of King David, the conventional subject to mark the penitential psalms. The scribes of both manuscripts started with a page already ruled to define the text area and the lines within it. Both then left a number of lines unwritten for a miniature. Conventionally, the miniature would fill that ruled text area, as it does in the earlier manuscript. Miniature and text were then surrounded by a decorative border. Fouquet, on the other hand, has taken over the whole area of miniature and border to make a coherent picture that even subsumes the obtrusive text into a spatially coherent illusion. He was not the first illuminator to do this. One of the earlier examples comes from another anonymous Parisian illuminator, the Bedford master, in a book of Ars of about 1430. You can see an ordinary page of text surrounded by a border that is facing a page with a miniature of the Nativity, the traditional subject to mark the liturgical hour of prime in the office of the Virgin. There is no border, so that the whole area is devoted to pictorial content. Unlike the Chevalier or Morgan Library hours, however, there is still a sense of miniature and border. Although the space is continuous, the central scene in the stable fills the traditional area of the miniature, above and to the width of the text, while additional scenes of the shepherds and of the Holy Family fill what would have been the border area. Like Fouquet, though, the Bedford master tries to incorporate the two-dimensional text into his three-dimensional illusion, albeit in a rather tentative fashion. The landscape appears to continue behind the text, while the thatched chimney on the left is deliberately painted over the gold framing, thus positioning the text behind the chimney and before the stable roof. It is conceivable that Fouquet could have seen, if not this miniature, then something like it, but equally possible that two painters independently evolved similar responses to the integration of text and image. Fouquet's solution is far more consistent and also more cleverly exploited. The miniature of the martyrdom of St. Apollonia from the Chevalier hours deploys the same system as that of St. John on Patmos. By effectively placing the text on a board, Fouquet gave an illusion of verticality to the inevitable flatness of black text on white page, of course no longer visible, and reinforced that verticality by setting the board before a vertical surface, natural or man-made, here a fence. Rounded so that its curves recede emphatically away behind the flat board, this vertical surface divides the miniature into two levels. Above it, a main stage for the central scene is imagined stretching usually from midground to background. Below it is a lower, much more restricted stage, occupying the foreground. I chose St. Apollonia to describe this structuring because here Fouquet gives us a literal stage, presenting her martyrdom as it might be performed by contemporary actors, complete with director to the right and bare-bottomed fool to the left. Fouquet's inventiveness in devising this conceit, in skill in creating a composition of such complexity and detail, are utterly astounding, to me at least. He used these front stages in a variety of ways. Here on the lower stage, wild men and women support the board with text and then shields with Chevalier's name and EE badge, fulfilling a similar role to the puttee below St. John. But Fouquet's inventiveness was not limited to the main subjects of the miniatures. These lower scenes are also very varied. In this miniature, Christ is brought before Pilate in the main scene, while the historiated initial and the lower scene continue the narrative. The wall defining the drop from Pilate's raised hall to the paved foreground encloses a prison. The two thieves are being brought up through a doorway to be taken to Golgotha, while on the left carpenters fashion the crosses. The initial is used for the flagellation of Christ, presented in golden brown and so distinguished as an illuminated initial, quite separate from the surrounding representation of a recreated historical event in full colour. The initial belongs with the text board, placed against the vertical surface of the wall, indeed supported on two wall brackets. Here its text replaced not by painted flowers, but by a section of border decoration cut from a later 15th century manuscript. Painting's ability to mimic other art forms appealed to Fouquet as he played with different levels of representation, inviting consideration of the infinitely complex relationship between art and reality, reality and illusion. These concerns are fundamental to Netherlandish painting, priming the young Fouquet to respond to similar concerns in Italy, where they were to be found not so much in painting as in the sculpture of Donatello, whose ciborium I showed earlier. In the miniature on the left, St. Martin divides his cloak with the beggar in a magnificent scene where a curving roadway is set against a right-angled wall in a double vanishing point perspective construction, one to either side beyond the picture area. Below are further scenes from the saint's life, presented through the obvious artificiality of the historiated initial and through the fictive diptych that supports the text board. Also in monochrome, the diptych seems deliberately ambiguous, painting or metalwork. Other images within images are more straightforward. The Magdalene at Christ's tomb in the lower scene on the right is clearly a fictive panel painting. In the initial, the fully realised depiction of her encounter with the resurrected Christ is also in colour, matching the spatial illusion of the surrounding scene. Above, the Magdalene anoints Christ's feet on a floor paved with rectangular slabs that are made to curve slightly to the edge of the picture, just as in the opening diptych, to give a material form to an optical illusion. This solution to the combination of text and image was in one sense rigid, following a consistent system. The text was incorporated into the image by presenting it as if on a board parallel to a vertical surface that marked the drop from an upper stage for the main scene to a shallower foreground stage where the board was supported. In another sense, it was very flexible, allowing for stages of diverse shapes, heights and illusory depths, depicted with varying forms of perspective, with the lower foreground stage available for whatever content was desired around the fixed element of the text board. Fouquet's essentially two-tier system was open to rich possibilities of variation in both spatial illusion and ways of carrying meaning. On the miniature pages of the Chevalier Hours, the pictorial content literally dominates the text, which is either relegated to the foot of the page, as in this less mutilated page from the Hours of the Holy Ghost, where the faithful are defended from demons before Notre Dame at the Ile de la Cité of Paris, or the text is subsumed within the pictorial illusion, as here from the Hours of the Cross, where Etienne Chevalier kneels by the slab on which Christ's body was anointed for burial, with an approximation of the Dome of the Rock identifying Jerusalem in the background. Fouquet's interest in topographical accuracy was not limited to the monuments of ancient Rome. The text has become subservient to the illumination, contradicting the origin and function of illumination, which was to clarify text through colour. If we return to the earlier Book of Hours owned by Etienne Chevalier, we can see decoration that is beautiful and desirable in itself, but which nonetheless has the overriding function of structuring text. As with Fouquet's Chevalier Hours, the miniatures mark the major divisions. For some texts, like Books of Hours, their subjects were well enough known to signal the content of each division. King David for the penitential psalms on the left, and the Visitation for Lords of the Hours of the Virgin in the centre. For the reader to find his way within each section, it was usual to have a hierarchy of decoration, where size of letter, quantity and nature of illumination guide the reader through the book. Opposite the Visitation, we see that the beginning of a psalm is indicated by a two-line large initial letter on a gold ground, which leads into sprays of leaves that fill the border to that side, whereas each verse within a psalm has only a one-line initial in gold with penwork decoration in red or blue. Spacing was beginning to supplement colour as a means of articulating text, even before the printing press. Each verse starts on a new line, but colour was still essential. Even the cheapest manuscript on paper usually has at least some red or blue initials and red headings. The penwork flourishing may extend into the margins, but without forming a coherent border. Turning the pages of this book, the presence or absence of a border immediately shows whether a significant division of the text opens on that page. Although the principle of a descending scale of decoration to guide the reader through the text is constant, its precise form will vary from book to book. In Fouquet's Chevalier Hours, we find on the other side of the miniature leaves, and on the one surviving double leaf of text, that two- and one-line initials work in much the same way, whereas the borders will be no help to the reader, since every page has a border, a luxurious possibility that existed before Fouquet. The text pages shown here would not have been seen together like this, but they give an idea of how an opening would have looked across the book. Fouquet himself is unlikely to have painted these borders, even though there are miniatures on the other side of the leaves. The one on the right is among those borders revealing a knowledge of the earlier Book of Hours, presumably gained when Etienne Chevalier had his badge added below the David miniature. The physical connection between the text page border and the large initial in that book has been lost in Fouquet's Chevalier Hours, where completely separate blocks of decoration are enclosed within their own rule guidelines to either side of the text. On the rectos of the leaves, the right-hand pages, the border decoration is no longer adjacent to the letters from which it originally sprang. It has been freed so that it fills the broader outer margin, matching the border on the opposite verso. This gives a pleasing symmetry to the layout across the opening, but does not assist navigation of the text. The freeing of illumination from text receives its ultimate expression when the decision to have a border on every page even runs to borders on pages with no text at all. Originally, the empty page on the left faced a miniature which has been removed. The faint lines of writing you may be able to see are by a later hand to replace the text lost with the miniature. This is a Book of Hours for the use of Angers, not far from Tours, produced by a group of illuminators associated with Fouquet, who may himself have worked in Angers before settling in Tours. Fouquet contributed only one miniature to this Book of Hours, of the stigmatization of St. Francis. Even in this more conventionally designed miniature page, we see Fouquet pushing against the restrictions of convention, extending the miniature to both sides and at the top, taking it beyond the height of the text area seen on the opposite page to match the height of the facing border. Fouquet was perhaps called on specially for this one miniature, since it includes a careful portrait of an ecclesiastic, presumably the owner or intended recipient. The trends to free borders from text, to let visual appeal overrule function, provide an appropriate context for Fouquet's expansion of pictorial content. Yet how far Fouquet was involved in the whole process of book production remains an open question. To complete a book, parchment makers and preparers, scribes and binders, as well as illuminators for anything above the cheapest level, were all required, and were perhaps coordinated by a libraire or publisher, who provided the capital for speculative production and might himself practice one of the book crafts. This may explain why the books to which Fouquet contributed remained essentially French in their manufacture and overall appearance. The Netherlandish elements in Fouquet's panel painting of course also occur in his miniatures, as in this depiction of St. Luke in the Book of Hours in the Morgan Library. The exquisite still life detail, with its play of light on and through different surfaces, echoes those by Van Eyck. The receding corridor is a motif that could have come from Eyckian or Italian precedents, and is probably a fusion of both. Netherlandish illumination seems to have had little influence on Fouquet. It was rather French styles of border patterns that influenced the Netherlands, as seen around the start of a prayer to the Virgin on the right-hand page of this Book of Hours, presumably made for the lady seen on the left. She is usually identified as Mary of Burgundy, the only child and heiress of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and effective ruler of the Netherlands. The Netherlands had devised a distinct method of production for standard texts like Books of Hours, where scribes started each major section of a book on a fresh recto, right-hand page, so that miniatures painted on independent sheets of conventional subjects could be inserted opposite to appear on the left-hand page. This speeded up production on the assembly line principle and gave flexibility. A purchaser could decide how many miniatures were wanted, or easily purchase more miniatures in the future. Even when a book was specially commissioned, as this one was, the miniatures are still on independent leaves. It was only towards the end of Fouquet's life that distinctive types of border decoration developed in the Netherlands. This miniature, that gives the master of Mary of Burgundy his name, reveals an approach not unlike Fouquet's to the integration of border and miniature into a continuous illusion, although in the Netherlands a distinct miniature area nearly always remains apparent, as here. The lady reading her book in the framing seems to be in an oratory overlooking a church. She is presumably the same as the lady who appears within the church, kneeling before the Virgin in an expression of a devotional reality. More typical of the new Netherlandish borders are those with naturalistic flowers and plants, often mixed with stylized acanthus leaves as here, that cast shadows on the page as if scattered over it. Most of the miniatures from this book of ours are in an album in Berlin. The rest of the book is in the National Library in Madrid. Known as the Votre Demeure Hours from the motto of its unknown owner, the book has wonderfully inventive borders, some by the Master of Mary of Burgundy. If the Netherlands contributed little to Fouquet's attitudes to manuscript illumination, what of Italy? Fouquet's interest in the Italian revival of antiquity did not apparently extend to Italian illumination. The writing of this copy of Virgil's works was completed in Rome in 1447, when Fouquet was possibly still there. Texts, of course, were central to the humanist revival of antiquity, and book producers were as keen to follow the new trends as other artists and craftsmen. The headings here are in capitals derived from incised Roman inscriptions, which had some influence on the inscriptions within Fouquet's paintings. The poems, however, are written in a humanist script based on the Carolingian minuscule of copies of Roman texts dating from the 9th to 12th centuries, which were eagerly hunted for and studied. Humanist script was favoured by scholars in part for its legibility. Fouquet seems, however, to have taken an interest in neither humanist script nor the decoration that accompanied it. The so-called white vine decoration was already by the 1440s the way of signalling the antique revival in manuscripts from Florence and Rome, although it had nothing to do with the Rome of antiquity. Instead, it came from the same sources as the humanist script, but slightly later, being found chiefly in 12th century manuscripts. Was it apparently ignored by Fouquet because he was aware of its dubious status as representing antiquity? Or is the absence of illumination from the very sparse evidence for Fouquet's stay in Rome a reflection of his dominant concerns at the time? It is also possible that even in France, Fouquet was called on for miniatures, but played little part in other aspects of book illumination. This is a more luxurious example of white vine decoration of the 1440s from Florence, where the style began. Of course, Fouquet shared motifs with Italian illuminators, like the putti bearing coats of arms. Here the space left empty for arms was filled later, but such motifs are shared across art forms, as we saw Donatello's versions in marble earlier. As in the Netherlands, there were illuminators in Italy evolving ideas similar to Fouquet's, though again rather later. This is particularly so for the architectural frontispiece, which evolved in northern Italy. Here is a comparatively early example from Padua of circa 1463-4. The first title heading is placed below a relief of Petrarch and Laura in a representation akin to a Roman tomb. On the facing page, the text proper is framed by coloured architecture. This development postdates Fouquet's time in Rome, yet, once Fouquet's interest in Italian art had been awakened, books were probably his best chance of seeing Italian art in France. Books are good travellers, traded alone or accompanying their owners or being sent as gifts. The second contemporary witness to Fouquet's stay in Rome is the Italian scribe Francesco Florio, who was in Tours in the years around 1470 and was a great admirer of Fouquet's work. If Fouquet had wanted to know more about Italian illumination at that point, Florio could surely have informed him. Perhaps some renewed contact with Italian books or bookmen helped inspire Fouquet's treatment of the Annunciation in the Book of Hours in the Morgan Library in New York. Or was Fouquet still finding inspiration in his patterns from Rome, where Donatello's ciborium seems a likely source? The open building housing Gabriel and the Virgin serves as both setting and frame, and, appropriately for a frame, also as a bearer of text. The opening words of the Office of the Virgin appear as if carved into the building's base. St. John's text was incorporated into his miniature through the two-stage device seen in many miniatures of the Chevalier Hours. For the Annunciation, marking the most important section of the book, an apparently new solution was used that even more emphatically removes the independent existence of the text and subsumes it into the image. The architecture acts as a frame only to the central scene and not to all the pictorial content. Putti lean off the roof with scrolls bearing a motto of the book's patron, perhaps Antoine Raguier, like Chevalier, a successful royal administrator. The motto is repeated at the bottom, where it is presented as if over a marble surround. A subsequent binder who did not realise there was one miniature larger than the rest severely trimmed this surround, while the tight binding obscures the left edge. The marble may be intended to represent a window through which we witness the Annunciation. It is possible, though less likely from the way it cuts the building to the right, that it represents a marbled picture frame, and that Fouquet is once again playing with images of images. The subtlety, variety, and sheer visual pleasure of Fouquet's work make it difficult to do him justice within a one-hour lecture, especially when trying to demonstrate his originality by placing his work as an illuminator in a wider context. I have paired the very Italianate Annunciation with St. John's evocative landscape to sum up his fusion of the two great traditions of the early Renaissance. Rooted in the subtleties and compelling illusionism of Netherlandish painting, Fouquet learnt to deploy the decoration and vocabulary of antiquity and to go beyond Italian geometric perspective as he evolved ways of showing things as they are experienced rather than as they are known to be. He continued to explore the limitless potential of painting and may have gone on from the Morgan Annunciation to produce miniatures that are certainly imitation pictures and which have failed to survive. His successor as painter to Louis XI, and perhaps pupil or assistant, Jean Baudichon, certainly did so, conceivably following a lost Fouquet original. Here, in the Book of Hours of the Queen of France, Anne of Brittany, of 1503–8, Baudichon produced a series of fictive panel paintings set against black backgrounds. Their simple wooden frames echo the one on St. Luke's own panel painting of the Virgin, seen within the miniature. With texts readily available in print, possibly with extensive printed illustration, the illuminated manuscript survived at the upper end of the market by emphasising the illumination, the pictorial. Anne of Brittany had a Book of Hours that was also a picture gallery, and, again, a herbal, with Baudichon using the Netherlandish scatter border to present botanical specimens labelled in French and Latin, and so bringing a new dimension to the fusion of the Netherlandish and Italian traditions achieved by Fouquet. Miniatures as fictive panel paintings, text subsumed into pictorial illusion or banished to the foot of the page, decoration freed from its dependence on text, all represent a fundamental shift in the conventions of book illumination as the servant of text. This shift coincided with the ever-growing demand for independent paintings on cloth and panel, and predated the ultimate separation of scribe and illuminator, text and colour, signalled by the development of printing. In the final decades of Fouquet's life, the value of the illuminated manuscript as a collection of paintings was surely heightened by contrast with printed books and their limited potential for decoration. In considering such wider trends, Fouquet's individual contribution should not be underestimated. His original approach to illusionism and to conventions for both subject matter and page design may have been fostered by a training and interests weighted towards painting rather than illumination. Changing attitudes to the relationship of writing and painting within books did not start with Fouquet, but his unique genius, fueled by experience of Netherlandish and Italian art, opened up new possibilities for manuscript illumination. It has been a privilege to speak to you tonight about one of my favourite topics within the history of art, and I am very grateful to you, the audience, and particularly to the Foundation of the Friends of the Prado for providing me with this opportunity. I hope you too can share my enthusiasm for Fouquet. Thank you.